Hi, I'm Peter Hawkins, and I'm delighted to talk to you about xAPI. We'll cover off some issues to do with privacy and best practice and how to go about planning your implementation. We'll also see a little bit about how you should do your preparation for an implementation, and as part of that, we'll be discussing how that relates to data privacy. But before we get to it, I'd like to cover off why data privacy is such an important consideration. So let's begin by looking at where we've come. Now, if we go back to the late 80s with the AICC standard, all we were recording was whether people passed or failed. 12 years later, we've got SCORM and we captured the big four. That included time people spent on things, whether they completed their scores. We even could capture information like which of the options somebody chose in a multiple choice question, that sort of thing. But it's still very closely tied to performance on an e-learning course. And of course, xAPI opens that up. So we can now capture information such as how people navigate through an e-learning course, or when they're doing a video, we can look at whether they chose to fast forward or pause that video. And, we can also do things like analyze how they interact with some things, such as, whether they noticed and clicked a particular button and that sort of thing. So it's a great tool. And the question is there a privacy issue if that's all we're doing? Well, xAPI doesn't only capture information about performance on an e-learning course. I did a project actually in which we were capturing information about students borrowing books from a library. It was all to do with their education, but nevertheless. And the same project and other projects I've worked on have been interested in whether students participated in social media, such as on forums, and whether they were active. Again, it's usually related to their training and their education, and that's fine. But it's broad. And we also can capture on the job information. So the Internet of Things is an integral part of xAPI. And one of the things that I talk about sometimes is how you would go about training a barista. Because whilst there's a lot of theory and some of the training is done in a classroom, much of it is done on the job, making coffees. And the way you would want to assess somebody in an ideal world is to use data collected by the cappuccino machine or the coffee machine about how effectively that person took on what was taught. And so maybe you would capture information from that. Maybe it'd be really good to capture information like feedback from customers, how much they enjoyed the coffee. So we're now getting third-party information as well. It starts to sound a little bit concerning to some people when we add in, for example, artificial intelligence. And that's not unusual as a way of analysing the sort of information that's coming in through xAPI. AI can predict patterns of behaviour, and I've seen it look at whether a student is likely to begin to fail in the future. Again, great intentions. Allowing teachers to intervene early is marvellous, potentially. But not everybody is entirely comfortable with that? Do people buy into it? It's new. What's the risk? Would you be completely comfortable as a student if you learned that the university was looking at patterns of behaviour, not just in the classroom, that are then being analysed by some machine with artificial intelligence to determine whether you're going to do well next year? You might be a bit concerned. You might also be worried if you learned that one of the patterns that it looks for, and this would be quite a good measure actually of how students are at risk, is whether they do their homework at the last minute. And you can do that. For example, if the student went to the library at the last minute to borrow the textbook they needed, you would know that they're working quite late on the project. That, as I say, could be a useful tool to determine which students need support. The ones that are not doing things in the way that they should maybe are the ones that need help. And so the intention might be very good, but would the student do it that way? What if you find that your employer is looking to determine how effective the training is in terms of how productive people are after doing it? Well, that sounds good. And maybe capturing information about what days of the week you are most productive. Or looking at the feedback customers are giving you when you serve them. Once again, could be a useful measure of how effective the training is. Well-intentioned, but are you comfortable with it? We did some work with a fire authority that was aimed at helping to keep volunteer firefighters safe. Very important stuff. Up to that point, they had done all of their training in a classroom situation. And there's a very, very dangerous situation called a burnover in a forest fire, where a fire truck can be so surrounded by a bushfire that you can't see your hand in front of your face. It's completely dark. You can't hear anything. It's deafening noise. And you may or may not know exactly where you are. All you can do is sit there and hope for the best and call for help. So we were doing training which was designed to measure whether the student called Mayday correctly and whether they accurately defined their location. Now, it's a terrific life-saving potential opportunity. And what we do is we put voice recognition tools into fire trucks. And rather than the people learning about how to respond in an artificial classroom situation, you can actually have this conducted in an actual forest in a far more realistic setting. Do they accurately describe their location, for example? Now, as I say, it may well save somebody's life. But there are plenty of people who didn't sign up for that when they became a volunteer firefighter. And, certain people are going to question whether it's okay to be so intrusive as to feed their Mayday, Mayday, Mayday call through a voice recognition tool and have some tool somewhere else gather information about how well they do. Now, as a trainer, you know perfectly well that what you're doing is well-intentioned and designed to help the person. But, most of us have experienced data leaks in recent times, and we know that data collected for the best purposes is sometimes lost to the world, and we don't necessarily trust data protection anymore. And we don't know whether things are to be used in the way they intended. And so the point I'm making is that it's important for us in this new xAPI world to remember that our students and our other stakeholders may not share our confidence in the intentions and the use of the data we collect, and for that matter, the security we put around protecting it. And given that we are trying to persuade our employers to adopt something new, and they're naturally going to ask the question, well, do we need it? We've got by so far. It's a little bit harder to do that when they have legitimate fears. And so that is the reason we need to think about privacy. It's a potential roadblock to implementing xAPI in the first place. And I have seen organisations that have shied away from xAPI, perfectly good projects, because they're frightened of what can happen. So the question is how we address it. So the first thing I'd like to say is that we've addressed data privacy issues in so many walks of life that the good news is that we actually do have established solutions for much of this. So let's begin by looking at what xAPI really is. When you boil it down, xAPI is simply a data format. It's actually just an idea. Hey, let's record information as a 3-word phrase, an actor, a verb, and an object. It doesn't actually constitute capturing any information in the first place. It is simply standard saying, this is the lexicon we'll use. Let's have 3-word phrases. So in its simplest form, xAPI is simply a convenient way to describe experiences. That of itself isn't scary. So it's not xAPI itself that's frightening. It's what we do with it. It's how we choose to use xAPI, and then what we do with that information. That's where the concerns will come from. Okay, so now we've got a handle on the scope of the concern. The scope being not xAPI itself. I don't think anyone's frightened of us describing experiences in 3-word phrases. No, they're concerned about what are you going to do now that you've got this capability. Okay. So the answer to that is, well, let's treat xAPI like any other data collection. Let's use good data hygiene. We already do that. Let's make sure that when we collect information, we follow the same 4 considerations that we do in the data privacy legislations. For example, my country, Australia, we've got the data privacy principles. There's another one in in Europe, as you know, and then there are data privacy rules across America in different states, and these boil down to four considerations: what we collect, how we collect it, what we do with it, and of course how we store it. So, from an xAPI point of view, let's think about first of all what we collect. And to understand this, I'd like to tell you another story. For those of you that have been lucky enough to go to the ATD conference, it's a wonderful experience. There was one I went to just before COVID in Washington, DC. And I remember sitting in a room where there was a presentation about an xAPI project. And the whole presentation was devoted to the fact that what they'd done is ripped up everything that had been done before. And I was intrigued at that. I'm less so now because I've heard that story so many times. So many organisations begin with the idea that, hey, we should just capture it. You know, we want all this information. Just capture it all. Just capture it all. We don't know whether we want it yet, but, what we don't want is a situation in the future where we wished we'd captured something. So let's capture everything and we'll just then later on work out what we need amongst it. It's a natural instinct. The problem with that logic is that it was founded in the days before big data. There was a time when it made much more sense to say to a provider, look, let's err on the side of capturing it just in case we want it someday. Well, big data has changed that, because what happens now that so much is available is that you end up with a complete mess. So, the story tends to start somewhere here. Oh, this is cool. Let's capture everything. Oh, boy, that was a lot of work. Ooh, look how much data we've got. What were we trying to do with it again? We've got a mess. I call it the data swamp. And the result is a great big mass of data that's got pretty little meaning, and you can't interpret anything from it. And usually it results in something very similar to what I was describing in ATD. A project where you have to bring somebody in to strip it all back and hit the reset button. And they reboot small, and they focus, and they achieve more success. Now, I always tell people that I work with in xAPI to think of it like this. Start with a mission statement. Make sure you are very, very clear about what it is you want to achieve. From that, set some goals. From that, work out how you will analyse something to achieve those goals, what sort of analysis you want to measure them. And from that analysis, determine what data you need. So you don't start with the data. You don't start with, let's collect it all and then see what we can find later. No, you do the opposite. Data should be the last thing you look at. You begin with a mission statement. And the interesting thing is, all of the great xAPI case studies that you read about start with a really basic, simple mission statement. So, for example, you can find these online. Visa University had a particular problem. We've got a lot of different platforms and we want to consolidate the data. xAPI gives us an easy way to do that. I worked with Moody's and their problem was a different one. They were delivering videos all over the world and they wanted to know how engaged people were with them. So they wanted to use outcomes information, measures of how people were using the videos, as a way to improve the design of those videos. And then Caterpillar is another one you can read about online. And their mission statement was quite simple. They wanted, I beg your pardon, to incorporate quantifiable, practical assessments of people into their curriculum, and they did that with xAPI as well. Okay, nice, simple mission statements. So great case studies begin like that. Now, if you start there, and I'll leave it to you to imagine what some of their goals might have looked like, and from those, how they might have done their analysis, and from that, what data they might collect. And to do it, they're only going to need a relatively small amount of data. It's not just the size of the data, as you're going to see, it's also the nature of the data that gets changed when you've got clarity of your purpose. But my advice for xAPI success is always work backwards, collect what you want and only that. And it's not just from a privacy point of view, it's actually because you're far more likely to achieve your objective. But along the way, you'll have a really good response to anyone that's concerned about privacy as regards that first quadrant, what we collect. We're only collecting this. That's all we're collecting, and this is why. Okay. So let's have a look at Visa University. So we were interested in how to bring together a disparate set of platforms that had accumulated over the years, doing various aspects of training or providing knowledge bases or video streaming platforms and all of those sorts of things. They had multiple LMSs as well. All of these things. And look, for years they've thought about, should we integrate them? Well, it turned out to be practical. But xAPI gave a really easy overnight solution to that. If we turn every one of these objects into an LRP, a learning record provider, then they can send their key results to our LRS. And for the first time ever, we've got one place that will report on everything. And what was really awesome for Visa is in doing that, they could find what parts of this vast ecosystem were being used and what were not. They cancelled subscriptions and saved themselves a packet. So by looking at some of those platforms that accumulated that were no longer really providing value, they used xAPI to identify that and saved quite a lot of money. Now, that was an ancillary benefit, but it shows how purposeful it is to create an ecosystem from a whole lot of disparate parts. One of the things that xAPI is really good at. Now let's think about that pyramid. We've got a clear mission statement. Goals are things like identify components that are no longer needed, that we can cancel, and also have a single place where we can report on all of this and use it as a way of knowing who is accredited properly without having to go to lots of different tools to find out. Now, and having things lost, in the cracks between different systems. Okay, so those are going to be our goals. The analysis we want, well, for doing this is, for the first goal, what we want is usage statistics, how frequently things are used. And for the second goal, it's going to be pass and fail and dates. Okay, so we want pass and fail and date and usage. What's scary about that? I'm not even going to need any new data at all. This great result was achieved with current existing data and nothing that even is particularly frightening. It's limited to pass and fail when it comes to people, and the usage identifying systems that not being used anymore. You don't even have to have names for that. So any information you're trying to collect from those systems doesn't even need to be identified. So suddenly we've got really good results from existing data, just better consolidated. As a matter of fact, as you would be aware, the most terrifying data leaks that have happened on the dark web in recent years have come often from old legacy systems that are still hanging around and collected once valuable data. And, nobody knew whether they could shut them down or not. And somebody breaks in because they haven't maintained privacy on this old system well and steal information. So, actually I'd argue that this project enhanced people's privacy by getting rid of unnecessary data stores. Now, armed with that, building my case internally for why people should be confident in what we're doing is a no-brainer. It's really easy. So the first thing to consider is what we're collecting and, of course, why we're collecting it. So let's extend that discussion to the other two. So Visa University is not collecting any new information. It's only using existing data. Moody's, well, they're looking to improve usage of videos around the world. They're not in the least bit interested in who is using it. They want to know, is this video being watched? Is the stream being held up by core internet? How frequently is it used? They're not interested in names. So the data can be entirely anonymous to achieve their outcome. Not only that, it's not asking for new information anyway. It's asking for overall statistics. No new detailed information is needed. They want, in fact, it would be impossible to achieve their outcome with anything but high-level statistics. And that's the sort of analysis they want. So when they get to that analysis part of the pyramid, they say, well, we want statistics only. So there's no need to collect identifiable information. Now, when we get to Caterpillar, though, it's a different story. They want to incorporate quantifiable, practical assessments. And because they're trying to assess people, well, by virtue of that, it needs to be identifiable. So the answer is yes. Sometimes the data has to be identifiable, of course. But we know why in that case. That's fine where it's needed. But the point is that most often you'll find a lot of applications don't require identifiable data or even any new data. Now, what about those situations such as Caterpillar, where you do need to start identifying people in some way. Well, okay, so now let's look at the next quadrant, how we collect information. Now, there's a little known part of xAPI. We talk about actors. These are the subject in the three-word phrase, subject, verb, object. The technical term is actor. Now, if you read the xAPI standard, it's actually quite detailed about how you identify an actor or not. And by not, I mean it doesn't necessarily require the actor to be a person. Why it's called an actor? It's not assumed that this person or this statement will be describing a person, because it might or might not be. It might be, for example, a group. And you can see all sorts of applications where a group might be a useful measure. This particular group achieved this. If you've got people working collaboratively on something, then of course it makes perfect sense to record an experience by group. And as we'll see, there are many, many, many practical situations where the group is actually what you want. You know, if you collect things by the person, all you're going to have to do is then work out what group they belong to make sense of it once you get to the analysis phase. So depending on how you're grouping your data, you might find it makes perfect sense to never store the individual identity at all, simply to identify them as part of a group. Now, that's not always the case. And so that's why xAPI allows us to identify individuals, and the term they use for that is agent. So in xAPI language, when you hear agent, it means the actor is a person. It's an individual. But as I say, look at the standard. You don't have to define your actors as individuals. You can have either one. But, you know, even if you choose to have a group, then it doesn't have to be an identifiable one. It can be an anonymous group. That is a group where there is no way to know who were members of that group. And if your application doesn't require you to go back and find those individuals, if you're Moody's and you're interested in how this video played when it was shown in this particular country, well, does it matter that this particular person experienced this? No, you want to know what the overall experience was of people in that geographic region. And so it's actually superfluous to record anything more than the geographic region as an anonymous group, a group that's defined by the place, but you're not interested in the list of who was there. And your information is actually going to be more useful to you if you don't have to wade through that extra information because you're not using it. So an anonymous group would be entirely appropriate for that. By anonymous group, we mean a group of anonymous individuals. And so for a very large number of applications, an anonymous group is ideal. And so you've got yet another reason to give people confidence. There's no way that anyone is ever going to be able to steal their information. Of course, there are situations where you may want to identify the members of that group to use your data to good effect. And so, of course, it supports identified groups as well. Depending on what you want to do with it, you've actually, within the standard, got 3 not one, but 3 ways of identifying individuals. And you can identify them simply by a group mailbox, that is, an email that will, an email address that will go out to everybody in the group. And you can imagine certain situations where that's perfectly good. What you want to do is you want to know who the group was in a way that's identifiable, but you don't necessarily want to know each individual address within it. So you've got a group mailbox is one of the ways you can identify a group, and it's valid within the standard. You can also have a single code for the group. And again, that's not going to lead you back to the people. You can even have, if you want, an encrypted code. And that means that the data that's stored on the server can never be decrypted and led back to the person. You might be questioning why you'd want that. We'll come to that later. But the point I'm trying to make is that even if you want to identify people, it provides you with choices. It's amazing when you dig into xAPI just how much thought has gone into allowing you to collect what you need and no more. It's one of the best standards from a privacy point of view. And that extends to individuals, to agents. We were talking about how an actor can be an individual, can be an agent. And there are not 1, not 3, but 4 ways xAPI allows you to identify an agent. By name, sure. You can, if you need to have the names, then it's an option. You can identify an agent by their login ID to a system. So if, for example, you're capturing information about how they perform in e-learning courses and you're looking at results coming off an LMS, then you might have the login for the LMS as the way you identify people, and that's allowed too. You might decide to identify them by email. So those 3 are ones that, could be concerning to people, and therefore you would take care. But again, they're not the only ways of doing it. You can identify an agent by an encrypted code. The advantage of that, by the way, and we're going to look at a real situation in a minute, but the advantage of encrypted code is that information you gather, you can say that it belongs to this particular person. So all the information's coming in and the encrypted code stays the same. So it's all gathered together. You don't know who it was necessarily, but you know that all of this information pertains to that one individual, whoever they are. Now, let's actually look at a situation. This is real live data captured into an LRS. And we're hosting it for a client, CQU, Central Queensland University, an Australian university with 60,000 students. And if you think about organisations that need to be concerned about privacy, one of the ones at the top of the list is going to be a university. So it's hardly surprising that they take privacy extremely seriously, and so they should. But let's have a look at what we're collecting. We're collecting, people doing Moodle courses and, as I mentioned before, borrowing books or submitting things, watching videos, we collect that, participation in forums, all sorts of things. And all of it's here. But you're never going to tell me who this person is. It's an encrypted code. But of course, I know that those 2 events belonged to whoever 9BC48E1, BBFCA7C4D6, 3BB80C19E is. And there they are again. So you can tell something of a story about this particular person. So, and there is no way of taking this back and getting a name from it unless you are on the campus an administrator who has a list of names and generates this code, looks up this code in that list and says, right, this is the name that resulted in this code. But the people, us, storing this data, have no way of knowing who this was. So, in other words, what it means is built into the xAPI standard is this capability of making sure that only the person who must know who this is can ever do so, can ever find it out. And then they can put all sorts of structures around the circumstances in which they do that. So they can have policies that ensure that they do it for well-defined reasons and with whatever approval processes set up to allow them to refer to that list. And they need it for good reason. What CQU are doing with this data is looking for students that are at academic risk in the future. So this is going through an artificial intelligence engine that will say that this particular student needs assistance because they might be doing well on their exams now, but it forecasts that in some period in the future, they may struggle. So in those situations, it makes sense to be able to take this encrypted code, work backwards and find out who it was, and do something to make sure the student is supported. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do. But this is not just something we came up with, it's codified into the xAPI standard. The xAPI standard, as you're starting to learn, does a lot in terms of looking after data. So it allows you to collect information collectively as groups, potentially anonymous groups. If you do need agents, you can store the identity of the person or an encrypted code, and even with that, if you have to, work backwards. So this is a description of how that looks. So, the LRP might, the learning record provider, the library borrowing system, might know that Mary Doe borrowed a book To Kill a Mockingbird, and it sends a code, borrowed book, this is the agent, to the LRS. The LRS never even receives identifiable information. LRS sends back to the analysis tool that this code borrowed the book, got no idea that Mary is involved, and it performs its analysis. If that analysis looks and determines that this particular person needs support, then we can identify who they are. But in most cases, we're just simply looking at overall statistics, a graph like this, books borrowed during parts of the year, for example. And, for that purpose, for those sorts of purposes, encrypted codes are all you need. So that's fine. But in this rare situation where an AI tool says, hey, this 387T43287 needs some help, well, then we can go back and to the original LRP, which is on the campus. This is the library again, and say, who was that person? And we've kept a list, and an authorised person can ask the question under whatever circumstances and policies have been set up on campus to protect it, and identify that this particular person is Mary Doe, and here's Mary Doe's library use, and we can do whatever it is we need. So as you can see, xAPI is pretty good. It's better than a lot of the older data standards that you see around. most of them don't have this level of detail baked in. So I'm actually quite impressed. What's not often advertised is the fact that it exists. So the important thing that I'd like you to take from this part of the discussion is to know it's there. And then knowing it's there, remember to do this sort of thing and consider what you need. And you will find you get better results anyway by not wading through the data swamp and simply collecting what you need, not more. You can always add to it if you have other applications that come up in the future. But trust me, you will thank me, not just from a privacy point of view, but from a best practice point of view, if you simply capture what you actually are going to use. Which brings us to the last of our 4 quadrants, what we do with our data, which is one of the standard things that privacy legislation deals with. And what we do with it is also governed by our mission statement. These are the examples of mission statements that we looked at earlier. And, one of the best pieces of advice I can give you on this is not to have mission creep, not to look at your xAPI data set and say, let's have this additional goal without thinking it through. Because, the moment you start sort of adding complexity to your analysis, you'll start to find your conclusions are not great. And why? Well, because you didn't go through that process. You didn't have a clear mission statement that led you to a sensible set of goals that achieved that mission statement. Those goals weren't around, so you didn't necessarily think first about the sort of analysis that you need, and therefore didn't use that to determine the best data to achieve the analysis you need and ultimately achieve your mission statement. So, just sort of tacking things on like that in an unconsidered way is not going to give you great results anyway. What you want, by all means, by the way, expand your program. I'm just saying when you do so, make sure you consider carefully what you do. Now, how do you go about it? To avoid mission creep, the same set of guidelines that you would use with any other data system. You want good managerial oversight, you want clear policies, and you want to make sure they're adhered to. Document them. You want transparency. Those policies are going to include things like who's got access to the data, if it's encrypted and you've got a decryption mechanism, the circumstances in which that can be done and for what purpose. These are all the same things that you would expect to do with any other data. xAPI is just the same. Now, so from a technical point of view, it's good. There is also the policy side. So, there's making sure you get your ducks in a row. You've got your good oversight and your policies, and you're being transparent with people about what you're collecting and why. You see that on every website. Here's our privacy statement. Here's what we collected and the purpose we collected for. And your policy should also talk about this data destruction, how long you're going to keep it, for example, that sort of thing. And put that in place. xAPI, as you've seen, has got great mechanisms to help you implement it. It's going to be easier to implement than you'll find with sort of older data standards. It's a new one, so it's been built in the days of data privacy. And of course, make sure you comply with legislation, GDPR, for example, CCPA, or in Australia, we've got the Privacy Act. These sorts of things. Make sure you do that. It's like you would any other one. And the other thing I'd like to offer you is I represent a group called the xAPI users group, xapi.org.au. Now, it's free to join. It's my little plug. But one of the things that we offer is a range of tools. And one of the tools is this, and you can point your camera at it now to get a download, or you can contact me as well, and we can preview it. Looks like this. It's a planning tool, and it helps you adhere to a best practice rollout. Now, you can see we've got post-it notes. It's a mirror board, of course. We've got post-it notes up here at the moment because we were using it recently, but I thought I'd leave them there just so you can see what a typical planning session looks like. And as you can see, what we've been doing is thinking about what goals we want to achieve, what the events that give us useful information about that goal would be, and what we're going to capture at those events. So let's identify when we're going to trigger something. This will tell us what the learning record provider should be. It's going to be whichever tool is going to be involved in our process at the time this event occurs. Okay, so for example, if we're looking at implementing a review process for improvement and retirement of training documents, work instructions. What are some good events? Well, one of them is a legislation or regulation change. So then we ask ourselves, okay, what's a suitable learning record provider? Well, it could be, for example, a website, a government website that publishes these. So that could be our learning record provider. So that's why the event becomes important. It tells us what is going to cause us to capture some information, and therefore where we'll put our learning record providers. But then we start brainstorming, okay, so what do we capture at those instances? Well, and for that matter, how we're going to group it. So you can see here the suggestion was, okay, well, one of the things we will measure is reportable incidents for the previous year. So presumably they're talking about a safety policy in this instance. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to group it by location. So the moment we start doing that, we can see, okay, well, this is not going to be identifiable anyway. And so on. So this is the planning tool. And by doing this, we're working backwards from our goal to developing a series of things to capture. From that, we populate this table here, which tells us when a trigger event occurs. This system is going to capture the fact that something did this. This is our verb. With or what is the object. And there may be contextual information as well, and we captured some of that as well. And the contextual information is also recordable in xAPI. xAPI does let you capture a little more than subject, verb, and object. You can capture a bit of context as well if you want to. But from that, we then break that down further and we build a vocabulary in terms of, first of all, the verbs, and this describes the verbs that we need, and the activity types, which is a technical term for the category of object we need. Again, you'll find that in the xAPI standard. It's defining these as beyond the scope of today's session, but as you more on xAPI, you'll learn about some of these terms. But the important thing is that you populate these tables. And as you can see, by the time you've finished it, you're going to be really clear on exactly what you need. And more to the point, you're doing it not only from a privacy point of view, you're doing it to make sure your data is usable. And the beauty of it is that the more usable the data is, the better your answer is going to be from a privacy point of view. They actually go hand in hand. So you don't actually have to do extra to be good from a privacy point of view. You just have to make sure that your project is well thought through. And that's what you want in the first place. The last table, by the way, just so you know how to use it, is how we're going to analyze what we saw above. This is typically going to be a list of the sorts of charts we're going to generate, generated by some LRSs generate charts. Some I've seen people who feed their LRS data into, for example, Power BI to generate charts. But, I want to see a chart that shows me this. I'm going to generate it here this often. My horizontal and vertical axis will be this. And this is why. This is how I'm going to use it. Now, not only is this going to be a really valuable part of your planning of your project, but it's not a bad answer to somebody that's got concerns about how you're using the data as well. So this is a planning tool that we use for all of our implementations, and it addresses both issues at once, privacy and also best practice. Okay. So I'm really grateful to you for your time today. I am always happy to answer questions in this particular format. Unfortunately, sorry, I'm trying to get rid of that. In this particular situation, I can't answer them live, so I thought I'd leave you with my contact. So you can scan this or email me there, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you may have. So with that, I'll bid you farewell, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the next cohort. Bye now.